Summer, 1940. The sky over southern England is burning. From the French coast, a black swarm of Messerschmitts cuts through the clouds, their engines howling like a pack of wolves. Beneath them, the last defenders of Britain scramble to meet the onslaught, young men barely out of school, climbing into planes that the enemy mocks as relics. The Germans call them flying coffins. Slow, clumsy, outdated. They laugh that these British Hurricanes are no match for the sleek, silver Bf-109s of the Luftwaffe. But what the Germans don't yet know is that the Hurricane is about to become the storm that stops them. And behind its weathered aluminum skin lies the story of ordinary men, engineers, pilots, and dreamers who turned ridicule into legend and despair into defiance. Before the war began, the Hawker Hurricane was already old. When it first flew in 1935, it was hailed as a marvel, a new generation of monoplane fighter that replaced the fragile biplanes of the Great War. But by the time the Luftwaffe rolled across Europe, the Hurricane looked like a museum piece beside Germany's angular, all-metal Messerschmitts. Its fuselage was built with fabric stretched over a metal frame, a patchwork of wood, wires, and canvas. Pilots joked that one bullet could rip it apart. Even inside the Royal Air Force, some doubted its place in the coming storm. It was slower, less elegant, less glamorous than the Spitfire that shared the skies with it. Yet the Hurricane had something the Germans didn't see, something invisible to the naked eye. It was simple, tough, easy to repair. A machine that could be built by factory workers across Britain, even under bombardment. And while the Spitfire dazzled the newspapers, it was the Hurricane that quietly became the backbone of the RAF. Out of every 10 fighters in the air, 7 were Hurricanes. They weren't meant to outshine the enemy. They were meant to survive him. As the war spread like fire through Europe, the Hurricane was thrown into combat again and again. In France, it was bloodied and battered, outnumbered and outgunned. Dozens were shot down. The Luftwaffe pilots called it meat on the table. They laughed over radios as they tore through the slow-turning Hurricanes. But the men who flew them, men like Jeffrey Page, Douglas Bader, and dozens of nameless farm boys turned fighter pilots, refused to break. They flew these obsolete machines with the ferocity of men who knew they were the last line between Britain and annihilation. The Hurricane wasn't built for show. It was built to fight dirty. Its thick frame could take hits that would shatter a Spitfire. German bullets punched holes through the fabric skin. But the plane kept flying, leaking, smoking, trembling, but still deadly. Ground crews could patch it up in a few hours with linen and glue, send it back up before dusk. Where a Messerschmitt demanded precision tools and spare parts, a Hurricane could be fixed with bare hands and courage. It became the working man's fighter, a plane for mechanics, not aristocrats. And then came July 1940, Operation Sea Lion. Hitler's plan to invade Britain. To make that possible, his Air Force first had to destroy the RAF. Day after day, waves of bombers roared across the Channel, escorted by the Luftwaffe's elite. Above the green fields and burning cities, the Hurricanes rose to meet them. The sky became a furnace of tracer fire and smoke. The Germans came expecting easy prey. What they found was something else entirely. The Hurricanes didn't dance like Spitfires, they hunted. They dove headlong into bomber formations, their 8 machine guns shredding Heinkels and Dorniers in brutal close-range duels. It was chaos in the clouds, wings ripping apart, engines screaming, parachutes blooming like white flowers amid the smoke. And yet, again and again, the Hurricanes returned, sometimes with holes the size of fists in their wings, engines coughing. Pilots bleeding, but alive. The Luftwaffe began to notice. The Hurricanes. They don't go down, one captured pilot admitted. They just keep coming. Still, the German commanders mocked them. A peasant's plane, one officer sneered. The Spitfire is their sword. The hurricane is their club. But in the skies over Britain, that club was smashing their bombers to pieces, and on the ground, in makeshift hangars lit by flickering lamps, British mechanics worked through the nights, hands black with oil, faces gaunt from exhaustion, to bring each hurricane back to life. They used whatever they had: scrap metal, scavenged parts, even bits of other wrecked planes. Each patch, each bolt, carried the fingerprints of defiance. The hurricane was no longer just a fighter. It had become a symbol of resilience, of stubborn survival. As August bled into September, the Battle of Britain reached its peak. The Luftwaffe threw everything they had into the assault. But something was changing in the air. The hurricanes, once ridiculed, were holding the line, breaking wave after wave of bombers before they could reach London. The mockery in German radio chatter began to fade. The laughter stopped out by the end of that summer. The outdated hurricane had destroyed more enemy aircraft than all other British fighters combined. It had done what the world thought impossible. It had outflown the Luftwaffe's finest. But this story wasn't just about a machine. It was about the men inside it, ordinary people who faced fear in its purest form. They had no guarantee of survival, no illusions of glory. Only a cockpit of rattling steel, a heartbeat pounding louder than the engine, and a nation's hope resting on their shoulders. The Germans mocked the hurricane until it became the reason they failed to conquer the sky. They were not born as heroes. Most were barely 20. Some had never even left their hometowns before the war. Yet when the sirens wailed and the order came, "Scramble," they ran without hesitation. These were the hurricane pilots of the Royal Air Force, men forged not in privilege or glory, but in necessity. They were sons of farmers, mechanics, clerks, ordinary men who climbed into the cockpit of a machine everyone else had already dismissed. Inside the hurricane, the world felt brutally small. The engine's roar shook the bones. The cockpit canopy rattled with every gust of wind. Oil fumes burned the eyes. There was no space for fear, only instinct. When the ground fell away and the channel opened beneath them, every pilot knew that within minutes they might be dead. And yet, they went. Again and again. Douglas Bader was one of them, a man who, by every measure, should never have been there at all. Before the war, a crash had cost him both legs. The doctor said he'd never walk again, let alone fly. But Bader refused to accept that fate. He learned to walk on metal legs, then to run, then to fly. When war came, he demanded to be reinstated, and he was. They said the hurricane was too heavy, too rough for a man with artificial legs. Bader proved them wrong. He led entire squadrons into the thickest fighting, his courage infecting those around him. To his men, he wasn't just a pilot. He was proof that the impossible could be done. Others, like pilot officer Jeffrey Page, carried their own scars. Page was just 19 when his hurricane was hit over the channel. Flames engulfed the cockpit. His hands melted onto the control stick. He bailed out, burning, broken, but alive. In the hospital, when doctors told him he'd never fly again, he clenched what was left of his fists and whispered, "We'll see about that." Months later, wrapped in bandages, he was back in the air. These men were not chasing glory. They were defending something far more fragile: home. Behind every sortie, there was a thought that haunted them. Mothers, wives, children, sleeping beneath the cities below. Every plane that slipped past them meant fire on the ground, burning homes, shattered streets, the screams of civilians. That was why they fought, even when the odds felt hopeless. In the air, the hurricane was not graceful, but it was loyal. It absorbed punishment like a living thing, protecting its pilot with thick armor and stubborn will. In the chaos of combat, its slower speed became an advantage. German fighters, diving too fast, often overshot their targets, leaving themselves exposed. The hurricane's broad wings could turn sharply, bringing its guns to bear in a heartbeat. What the Luftwaffe thought of weakness became its hidden strength. The men learned this through blood and experience. They studied their enemies' patterns, how the Messerschmitts climbed, how they dove, how long they could fight before running low on fuel. Each engagement was a lesson written in fire. And slowly, the tide began to turn above the clouds. The dogfights became duels of endurance and will. Radio chatter mixed with panic and defiance. "Bandits, 12 o'clock. Break! Break! I've got one on my tail." The sky was filled with smoke trails and falling metal, but through it all, the hurricanes kept rising. Pilots watched their friends vanish in flames, yet stayed in formation. They had learned that fear was a weapon when the enemy depended on. So they denied it. Every day, they took off knowing the odds. Some squadrons lost half their men in a week. Every night, the empty chairs in the mess hall multiplied. And still, they flew. Because to stop was to surrender the sky, on the ground. The crews worked like ghosts, patching up bullet holes, refueling, rearming, preparing the next flight before the wreckage of the last had cooled. They had no rest. They slept beside the runways, woken by the next air raid. They too became part of the machine, nameless heroes whose hands kept Britain in the fight. Even as the Luftwaffe threw its best at them, the hurricanes endured. Each new raid was a test of steel, of spirit, of faith. And though the cost was unbearable, their courage began to show results. The once invincible German formations were breaking apart. The skies that had been the enemy's hunting ground were becoming Britain's shield. By late August, the Germans began to change tactics, shifting their attacks from airfields to cities, a desperate move born from frustration. The RAF, bloodied but unbroken, had survived. And at its heart stood the plane the world had mocked. The Hurricane had proven itself, not by elegance, not by speed, but by the courage of the men who refused to break inside it. They were ordinary souls who, when faced with annihilation, answered with defiance. In the smoke and thunder of 1940. They wrote a truth that still echoes through time. It's not the weapon that wins the battle. It's the will behind it. By September 1940, the air above Britain had become a graveyard of burned metal and falling ash. The Luftwaffe, once unstoppable, now faced something it hadn't expected: resistance that refused to die. Their commanders had promised Hitler the skies would be his within weeks. But the weeks dragged on, and still the British fighters came, tattered, smoking, patched together, but always there. And most of them bore the same blunt-nosed silhouette, the Hawker Hurricane. The German plan had been simple: crush the RAF on the ground, destroy their airfields, and sweep the sky clean. But the Hurricanes changed that plan. Their crews moved them constantly from field to field, hiding them under camouflage nets, launching from strips of grass that barely counted as runways. Even when Luftwaffe bombers hit their bases, the Hurricanes were already gone. Ghosts in the morning fog. It was the beginning of a subtle shift, one the Germans couldn't measure in numbers or maps. Every raid that failed to break the RAF drained a little more of their confidence. The Luftwaffe's elite fighter groups, proud and precise, began to tire. Their long flights from occupied France left them with only minutes to fight before fuel ran low. Meanwhile, the Hurricanes could rise, fight, and land within the safety of home. What had once been an advantage of technology became a trap of endurance. For the pilots of the Hurricanes, those days were a blur of exhaustion and adrenaline. They lived in a world of smoke and thunder, scrambling 3, 4, even 5 times a day. Some barely had time to eat. They learned to recognize each other not by names, but by the sound of engines, by the shape of wings passing overhead. A few seconds of radio static could mean life or death. Every climb into the sky was a roll of the dice. Yet amid the chaos, something extraordinary was happening. The Hurricanes, the mocked, the underestimated, were outscoring the Luftwaffe's best. Not by luck, but by grit. They learned the rhythm of the enemy attacks, the dance of the Messerschmitts, the weaknesses of their engines and guns. The British radar network, a silent ally, gave them precious minutes of warning, guiding them into ambush positions. When the Germans arrived, they found not easy prey, but hunters waiting for them. One German pilot, captured after bailing out, described it in disbelief. "We came to hunt, but the British were waiting like wolves." Day after day, the battle tilted. On September 15th, the Luftwaffe made its greatest push. Over 1,000 bombers and fighters crossed the Channel in a single assault, a sky black with engines. It was meant to break Britain's back. Instead, it became the day that broke theirs. From every airfield, hurricanes roared upward. Their pilots didn't think of strategy or survival. They thought of the ground below, of children hiding in tube stations, of families crouched in cellars praying the bombs wouldn't fall on them. And so they climbed into the storm. The battle that followed was chaos incarnate. Tracer fire lit the clouds. Bombers disintegrated mid-air. Engines screamed as fighters spiraled toward the earth. In the middle of it all, the hurricanes attacked with brutal precision. They tore through bomber formations at point-blank range, weaving between falling debris and burning fuel. Pilots could feel the heat of enemy engines exploding just meters away. They didn't flinch. By nightfall, the sky was theirs. The Luftwaffe had lost nearly 60 aircraft, more than double the British losses. It was the first sign that the unthinkable was happening. Hitler's Air Force, the terror of Europe, was being beaten. Word spread quickly through the squadrons. In the mess halls that night, men who hadn't smiled in weeks lifted their mugs in silence. They didn't celebrate, they simply breathed, for the first time in months, without the weight of defeat pressing down. They knew the war was far from over, but something had changed. The Luftwaffe had blinked. And for the first time since the dark days of France, the world saw that the British could stand alone and stand victorious. Newspapers across the globe printed the same image: the curved wings of a hurricane, streaked with soot and bullet holes, returning home through smoke-stained skies. It wasn't the sleek Spitfire that became the true face of survival. It was the rugged hurricane, the fighter that did the hard, unglamorous work. Even Winston Churchill understood what had happened. When he rose before Parliament and spoke the immortal words, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." Most of those few were hurricane pilots. The plane that had been mocked as obsolete had saved Britain from invasion, but beneath the triumph lay exhaustion and grief. Entire squadrons had been wiped out. Many who had fought that September never returned to see the victory they made possible. Their names were written only on fading rosters and the memories of the few who survived. Still, their courage had reshaped history. The Luftwaffe began to falter. Their raids grew smaller, their losses heavier. Hitler quietly postponed his invasion plans indefinitely. The threat that had loomed over Britain began to fade into the mist. And in its place rose the legend of the Hurricane, the machine that, through simplicity and sacrifice, outlasted the mightiest air force on Earth, long before the hurricane became a legend in the skies. It was born in the quiet hum of a workshop, designed not by a committee, but by one man's stubborn belief in practicality. Sydney Camm, a self-taught engineer from Windsor, was no glamorous figure of British industry. He had started his career building wooden gliders in a shed. He had grease on his hands more often than ink. But he possessed something the bureaucrats in London did not: a clear vision of war's reality. He knew that when the fighting began, Britain would not have the luxury of perfection. It would need a plane that could be built fast, repaired anywhere, and flown by anyone brave enough to climb inside. When Camm first proposed the Hurricane, the Air Ministry nearly rejected it. It was too crude, they said, too simple. By then, the sleek, all-metal Spitfire was already dazzling test pilots. But Camm held his ground. He argued that Britain needed numbers, not dreams. His Hurricane could be built using existing jigs and tools from the old biplane factories. No massive new facilities, no exotic materials. Just honest steel, wood, and hands that already knew how to work them. And that decision, that humble practicality, would later save a nation. When the bombs began to fall, Camm's foresight became Britain's lifeline. The Hurricane's design meant it could be built in small pieces, spread across dozens of workshops, away from the German bombers' targets. Women and men from every corner of the country, factory workers, carpenters, seamstresses, joined the effort. They built wings in one town, fuselages in another, stitching canvas over frames like tailors sewing armor. Every rivet, every stitch carried the quiet defiance of a people refusing to surrender. In the fields and hangars, the same design that seemed outdated became a miracle of survival. German bullets tore through the Hurricane's fabric skin, but instead of shattering like metal, the holes could be patched in hours. Mechanics joked that you could fix a Hurricane with a hammer and hope. But that wasn't far from the truth. They used tape, glue, scraps from wrecked planes, anything to keep them flying. These weren't soldiers in uniforms. They were civilians working under blackout curtains, trembling as sirens wailed overhead. They didn't hold rifles, yet every repaired plane was a shot fired back across the channel. Their names were never known to the public, but their work was written in every victory. Without them, the sky would have fallen. There was an unspoken bond between these workers and the pilots. When a damaged Hurricane limped back to base, holes punched through its wings, oil leaking, smoke curling from its engine, the ground crews swarmed it like surgeons around a wounded friend. They whispered encouragement to the machines as if the planes themselves could hear. "We'll have you flying again, old girl." And by dawn, somehow, it was. Each time a pilot climbed back into his repaired Hurricane, he carried the work of hundreds of unseen hands. It gave him strength to know he wasn't fighting alone. Behind every sortie was an entire nation, each person doing their small part to keep the sky from falling. Even the Hurricane's simplicity became a weapon of endurance. While German fighters demanded fine-tuned maintenance and specialized fuel, the Hurricane could run on less. Its rugged engine could survive abuse that would destroy a Messerschmitt. And when it crashed, which it often did, salvage teams stripped every usable part and fitted it into another plane. Nothing was wasted. The Hurricane was the ultimate expression of wartime ingenuity, a machine that refused to die, built by people who refused to give up. In a war defined by machines, it was humanity that gave this one its power. The engineers who designed it, the workers who built it, the mechanics who mended it, and the pilots who flew it, all threads woven together into something greater than the sum of its parts. Together, they created not just an aircraft, but a symbol. When the Luftwaffe began to falter, it wasn't only because of the Hurricanes in the sky, but because of the faith behind them, the belief that even an imperfect machine, built with heart and grit, could overcome a perfect one made with arrogance. That was the Hurricane's hidden strength. Not speed, not glamour, but soul. Every rivet was a promise. Every flight, a defiance. Every victory, a whisper from those factory floors. "You will not break us." And in that whisper, that collective, unyielding will of ordinary people, lay the secret that turned a mock machine into the storm that saved Britain. Asterisk. When the Battle of Britain ended, the world exhaled, but the war was far from over. Across the skies of North Africa, over the frozen fields of Russia, through the jungles of Burma and the deserts of the Middle East, the Hurricane flew again. It was no longer just Britain's shield. It had become the world's fighter. Everywhere the fight went, the old machine followed, scarred and patched, its wings carrying the defiance born over English skies. In North Africa, under a sun that turned metal into fire, Hurricanes roared low over the sand, strafing German convoys and Italian tanks. Dust clogged their engines, bullets shredded their canvas skin, but still they flew. Mechanics worked in the open heat, wrapping their faces with rags, their tools burning in their hands. The enemy laughed at first. They said the Hurricane could not survive the desert. But again, they were wrong. Its simplicity became its salvation. While more advanced planes failed in the choking dust, the Hurricane endured, repaired in the field with makeshift parts, and unbreakable will dot in Russia, where winter froze engines and men alike. Soviet pilots flew British-supplied Hurricanes into battles of impossible ferocity. They had few resources, no luxury of maintenance, yet they praised the aircraft that the world had once dismissed. "It is not elegant," one Russian pilot said, "but it is faithful. It brings me home." In those frozen skies, where mercy was rare and death constant, that was all that mattered. Everywhere it flew, the Hurricane carried with it the same quiet truth. Greatness does not demand perfection. It demands endurance. It demands heart. By the war's end, the Hurricane had become outdated once more, overtaken by faster, sleeker fighters like the Spitfire and the Mustang. Many were scrapped, their frames melted down, their stories forgotten. But for those who had lived inside them, the Hurricane never truly vanished. It lived in memory, in the roar of engines at dawn, in the faces of the comrades who never returned, in the peace that their struggle had bought. The pilots often spoke of the sound, that deep, trembling hum of the Merlin engine before takeoff. It wasn't the sharp scream of the Spitfire, but a steady, honest rumble, the sound of something that worked not because it was perfect, but because it was determined. That sound became the heartbeat of a generation. Years later, when veterans stood beneath museum ceilings, staring at restored Hurricanes hanging silent in the air, many would whisper under their breath, as if greeting an old friend. They remembered the smell of oil and smoke, the taste of fear, the weight of the controls beneath their hands. And for a moment, they were back in 1940, when the world's fate hung by a thread. And they had been the thread. The Hurricane story is not just one of metal and war. It's a story about people, about ordinary men and women who proved that courage does not come from strength, but from resolve. Sydney Camm, the engineer who believed in simplicity. The factory workers who built under bombardment. The mechanics who repaired by candlelight. The pilots who flew into death so that others could live. Together, they turned ridicule into respect. And perhaps that is the truest victory of all, that from something dismissed, something imperfect, came the instrument of survival. Because history remembers the beautiful. It remembers the Spitfire's grace, the Mustang's power. But the Hurricane's legacy lives deeper, in the quiet courage of those who fight not to be remembered, but simply to endure. When the German pilots mocked the Hurricane, they saw only weakness, a relic of another age. What they couldn't see was the strength that hid inside its frame, the human will. That is what outflew them. Not speed, not design, but the unbreakable heart of those who refuse to give in. And that is the lesson the Hurricane leaves behind, that in the face of overwhelming odds, when you have nothing left but your hands, your hope, and your defiance, even the most ordinary among us can rise into the storm and change the course of history. Because courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to rise again and again, even when the world believes you cannot.